Emily Carter's day had been uneventful, the kind of routine shift most EMTs hoped for. No tragic accidents, no cardiac arrests, no trauma calls. She had finished her 12-hour rotation just after sunset and stopped at a local strip mall to grab some groceries before heading home. Her ponytail was messy, and her scrubs still had faint stains from morning calls, but she didn't care. She was tired. All she wanted was dinner and sleep. As she stepped out of the small market with a paper bag in one hand and her phone in the other, she spotted someone staggering ahead near the taco shop. At first, she thought he was just another drunk tourist, until she saw the blood. The young man, mid-20 seconds at most, wore a torn Marine uniform. His right leg was dragging, and his side was soaked in red. His face was pale, almost ghostly, but he kept walking, clutching his ribs with trembling fingers. Most people nearby didn't seem to notice, too absorbed in their food or phones. Emily didn't hesitate. She rushed over, dropping her bag to the ground. Hey, sit down. You're bleeding," she said, supporting his weight as he collapsed slowly onto the curb. "I'm an EMT." He didn't speak, just nodded, breathing hard. His left shoulder was bruised, and his rib area looked like it had taken a major hit. She ripped open a gauze pack from her belt, applied pressure, and scanned for more wounds. Her hands moved on instinct, fast, trained, focused, but then something shifted. From the corner of her eye, two men approached quickly. One was tall, with a black hoodie pulled low over his face. The other had a shaved head, tattoos creeping up his neck. They weren't just passing by. They were headed straight for them. "Back off," one of them growled, eyeing the Marine. Emily stood halfway in front of the wounded man, confused but cautious. "He needs help. I've called for an ambulance." "No one asked you to," the tattooed one snapped. "Walk away." Emily's stomach dropped. Something wasn't right. The Marine behind her tried to speak. "They followed me," he whispered weakly. The pieces clicked together too fast. These weren't random guys. They had followed this Marine, targeted him, and now they wanted him alone. Emily's heart pounded. "You're not touching him," she said, planting her feet. "Back away now." The man in the hoodie pulled something from his pocket. The glint of a blade caught the street light, and then everything exploded. He lunged toward her, aiming for the Marine's chest. Emily threw herself sideways, intercepting him with her own body. The blade sank into her arm. She screamed but didn't fall. A second slash tore across her lower back as she twisted. She grabbed the attacker's wrist, trying to force the blade down. The other man kicked her in the ribs. She stumbled but didn't move from her spot between them and the Marine. The Marine, barely conscious, tried to push himself up but collapsed again. Emily's vision blurred. Blood ran freely down her side. Another stab, this one in her shoulder. She didn't know how many hits she'd taken. Her hands were slick, her legs wobbled. "Help!" she screamed. "Somebody call 911. People nearby had frozen. A few stood with phones in hand, recording, stunned into inaction. Only one voice shouted back, "Leave her alone." The attackers looked up, startled, and fled into the darkness. Emily dropped to her knees. The Marine was lying flat now, eyes fluttering. She pressed both hands against his side, trying to keep pressure on the bleeding. "I've got you," she whispered. "Stay with me." The world spun. Sirens finally rang out in the distance. Someone ran to her side, another EMT, off-duty like her, offering help. Hands replaced hers on the Marine's chest. A voice said, "You're losing a lot of blood. Hang on." She felt herself being lowered to the ground, someone holding her head, telling her to breathe. She looked up at the sky, stars blurred by pain and sirens, then darkness. The first thing Emily noticed as she faded in and out of consciousness was the wet warmth trickling down her side. Her hands trembled, her limbs sluggish, but her mind refused to let go. She kept repeating silently, "Don't die, not here, not now." But she wasn't thinking about herself. Her concern was still for the Marine. She blinked, fighting to stay awake, her field of vision narrowing into flashes, red lights, voices shouting, the smell of smoke and antiseptic. She couldn't make out the words, but she could feel pressure, someone applying gauze to her wounds. Her body hurt everywhere, Time blurred. When she regained clearer focus, she was inside the back of an ambulance, an oxygen mask secured. A paramedic hovered above her, calling her name over and over. Emily, Emily, stay with me. We're almost there. She couldn't speak. Her mouth was dry, her throat raw. She wanted to ask about the Marine. Was he alive? Did they get away? All she could manage was a soft groan before passing out again. Meanwhile, the scene outside had descended into controlled chaos. Police officers cordoned off the area, taking statements from shell-shocked witnesses. The taco shop's manager handed over grainy security footage. Most bystanders had left, but one man, a college student named Luis, stayed behind. He had been the one to shout at the attackers, scaring them off. He told the officers, "She jumped in front of the knife. She didn't even hesitate." Inside another ambulance, Corporal James Rivas was semi-conscious, clutching Emily's bloodied jacket. He had sustained cracked ribs and internal bleeding, but thanks to Emily's pressure and fast response, his vitals were stabilizing. One paramedic said quietly to his partner, "If she hadn't stepped in, he'd be dead right now." At the emergency room, Emily was wheeled in first. Her injuries were more severe than initially thought. She had been stabbed 7 times, twice in the back, once in the shoulder, 3 along her side, and 1 across her upper arm. A lung had collapsed. 2 ribs were fractured, but no major arteries were severed, a miracle. Doctors worked for hours. A surgical team stopped the internal bleeding and closed the wounds. She required 4 pints of blood and hours in intensive care. Still unconscious, she was moved to a recovery room. In the room next door, James was also stabilizing. He kept asking for her between gasps of pain. "The girl, the EMT, is she okay?" No one had an answer yet. Back at the police station, detectives were already identifying the suspects. Thanks to the surveillance footage and Luis's testimony, they had enough to issue a city alert. The attackers were members of a local gang known for harassing off-duty service members, especially those who refused to cooperate with their drug and weapons trafficking. James, though wounded, had been targeted for a reason. Just weeks before, he had stopped an illegal transaction outside his base and reported it. Retaliation had come fast and brutal, but they hadn't counted on Emily. That morning, Emily's mother, Karen, got the call no parent wants. "Your daughter's been injured. She's alive. She's in surgery." Karen dropped the phone. Her husband picked it up and asked, voice trembling, "Where? What happened?" Within an hour, they were at the hospital, pacing the sterile white floors of the ICU. The doctor emerged, calm but exhausted. "She's stable," he said. "She lost a lot of blood, but the wounds were clean. We managed to avoid permanent organ damage. She's incredibly lucky and brave." Karen pressed a hand to her mouth, tears falling. "When can we see her?" "As soon as she wakes," the doctor replied. Emily stirred hours later, groggy and confused. The sterile ceiling blurred overhead, tubes in her arms, bandages on her chest. She panicked briefly, disoriented, until a nurse leaned over and said gently, "You're safe. You're in the hospital. You made it." Her first question, "The Marine, is he okay?" The nurse smiled. "He's alive because of you." Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. She exhaled, pain rippling through her ribs, but she didn't care. Relief washed over her like a wave. The last thing she remembered was blood, so much blood and then darkness. "I thought he'd die," she whispered. "You saved his life," the nurse replied. "Everyone's talking about it." Later that night, a man in uniform appeared at her doorway. He was tall, clean-cut, and had the aura of someone used to authority. "Emily Carter?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I'm Captain Ramirez, representing the United States Marine Corps. Corporal James Rivas asked me to personally thank you on his behalf and on behalf of every Marine." He reached into his coat and placed a small bronze coin on her tray table. It was engraved with the Marine Corps emblem. "This is a challenge coin, not given lightly. James insisted you receive it." Emily stared at the coin, overwhelmed. "I just helped. That's my job." The captain smiled. "You didn't just help. You stood between a warrior and death. That makes you one of us." Emily Carter awoke to soft beeping and a dull ache spreading through her body like wildfire. Her eyes fluttered open, catching the sterile white ceiling above and the slow movement of IV fluids beside her. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, until the sharp pain in her side reminded her of everything: the blood, the knife, the Marine. She tried to move but gasped. Her ribs throbbed. Her arm was wrapped heavily in bandages. Her mouth felt dry. Her lips cracked. A nurse appeared almost instantly. "You're awake," the nurse said gently, checking her vitals. "Try not to move. You're in the ICU. You made it through surgery." Emily blinked slowly. "The Marine," she whispered, barely audible. "He's stable. Alive. You saved his life," the nurse said with a smile. Those words were like oxygen. Emily's body hurt more than it ever had, but something deep in her chest loosened. She didn't cry, not yet, but her hand weakly squeezed the sheets. The Marine, whoever he was, hadn't died. Her pain had meant something. The nurse gave her ice chips, explaining that she had been unconscious for nearly 18 hours after the surgery. 7 stab wounds, a collapsed lung, internal bleeding, yet she had survived. Her body had fought hard. Most would have blacked out sooner, the nurse said. Few would have remained standing, shielding someone else. Doctors are calling you a miracle. Emily just shook her head slowly. I just reacted. Later that evening, her family entered the room. Her mom immediately burst into tears and clutched Emily's hand like a lifeline. Her dad, never one for emotions, kissed her forehead and stood silently beside her, eyes glassy. I thought we lost you, her mother whispered. Emily offered a faint smile. I'm still here. Her sister entered next, holding a stack of cards, get well soon notes from hospital staff, EMT colleagues, and even people Emily had never met. One card simply read, "You saved one of ours. Thank you." She didn't understand it fully until the man from the night before returned. Captain Ramirez stood tall and formal beside her bed. This time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Corporal James Rivas, the very Marine she had shielded with her body. He walked slowly, still weak, a cane supporting his step. His face bore scratches and bruising, but his eyes were sharp, burning with gratitude. Miss Carter, he said quietly, nodding respectfully. Emily tried to sit up. You're okay. I am, thanks to you, James said, approaching her bedside. I owe you my life, and no words will ever be enough. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of fabric, his unit patch. This was mine, he said, placing it in her palm. Now it's yours. Emily stared at it, eyes widening. I don't understand, she said, breathless. Ramirez spoke. It's rare for a civilian to be awarded a Marine unit patch, but what you did wasn't ordinary. You put yourself between a soldier and a threat. That kind of courage doesn't come from training. It comes from instinct, honor, James added. In combat, we call that a guardian moment. And you, Emily, are a guardian. The conversation was emotional but short. James was still recovering, and so was she. But before leaving, he turned back with a firm voice. You didn't just save me, he said. You reminded every Marine what we fight for. People like you. When they left, Emily stared at the patch in her hand, stunned. All this for what she still believed was just instinct. Meanwhile, outside the hospital walls, the world was catching fire with her story. Footage of the attack had surfaced online. The grainy cell phone video didn't capture everything, but it showed Emily stepping in front of the Marine, shoving back one of the attackers, then taking several hits without backing down. It was raw, brutal, real. The video went viral overnight. Military veterans reposted it with captions like, "That's courage." Civilians called her a hero. Within hours, hashtags trended globally. Number Shield of Honor, number Hero EMT, number Emily Strong. News anchors spoke her name across morning shows. Editorials called her the spine of America. But Emily didn't know any of it yet. She was still recovering, shielded from the chaos. Back in the police department, leads were flooding in. 2 men had been identified, both members of a local gang linked to previous attacks on veterans. Arrest warrants were issued. One was caught that same day, hiding in a motel. The other was still at large. The DA was preparing charges: attempted murder, gang activity, assault with a deadly weapon. But even amid all that, What gripped the city wasn't fear, it was pride. Pride in a young woman who didn't run away. Pride in someone who stood when no one else did. Back in her hospital bed, Emily finally broke down, not from pain, but from something deeper. She felt overwhelmed. The attention, the gratitude, the weight of what she had done. "I just wanted to help," she whispered to her mom. "That's all I was trying to do." Her mother kissed her forehead gently. "And you did, sweetheart, more than you'll ever know." Emily turned her head to the window. The sky was a dusky blue. In the reflection, she could see herself, bruised, bandaged, barely standing, but alive. And behind her reflection, something unexpected caught her eye. A group of uniformed Marines standing in the hospital corridor, silent, waiting, not for news, not for orders for her. Emily didn't understand how fast things had escalated. One day she was fighting to stay alive in a hospital bed, and the next her face was all over national news. When she finally gained the strength to sit up on her own, a nurse walked in, smiling, and handed her a tablet. "You might want to see this," she said. Emily tapped the screen. A video began playing, a shaky, zoomed-in cell phone recording from the night of the stabbing. It was short, only 30 seconds, but it captured everything that mattered. She saw herself standing in front of the injured Marine, arms outstretched. One of the attackers lunged with a knife. She pushed the Marine behind her and took the hit, another slash, and another. People screamed. She stayed standing. Her heart dropped watching it. She looked pale, small, almost fragile. Yet something in her eyes during that moment looked unbreakable. She handed the tablet back to the nurse. "I don't want to see more," she whispered. But the world had already seen enough. The video had racked up millions of views. It wasn't just circulating in military circles, it had gone global. People called her the Shield, the EMT Guardian, America's bravest. News anchors debated whether she should be given the Medal of Freedom. Late-night shows honored her with tribute segments. Celebrities posted about her. A veteran group began printing her image onto shirts with the caption, "She stood so he could live." Emily didn't want any of it. She turned off the television, shut down her phone, and asked the nurses to hold off any interviews. She hadn't done it for fame. In fact, the attention made her uncomfortable, but that didn't stop it. The hospital had to install security outside her room. People were trying to bring flowers, letters, gifts, even strangers wanting to shake her hand. One man drove 200 miles just to leave a note outside her door that read, "I served 2 tours. I lost men. What you did was what we all pray someone would do for us. You are one of us now." That message hit her harder than the blade ever had. Meanwhile, Corporal James Rivas remained in recovery just 2 doors down. The two hadn't spoken since that first moment he gave her his unit patch, but they kept asking the nurses about each other. On the 3rd day, he asked if he could visit her room. When he entered, his posture was stiff, still healing, but his presence was steady. "You okay with visitors?" he asked, softly. She smiled, gesturing to the chair beside her. "You're kind of the only visitor that makes sense." They sat together for a long time in silence. Words didn't come easy. What do you say to someone whose life you nearly died for, or someone who lived because you bled? Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Why were they after you?" James hesitated. "I got in their way, stopped something I wasn't supposed to see. They'd been waiting for the right moment." "And you were alone?" "Yeah," he nodded. "Until you weren't." Those words hung in the air like a promise neither of them expected. Outside, the Marine Corps was already moving. High-ranking officials had taken note of the story, and more than that, the symbol Emily had become. They saw it as a living embodiment of Marine values: courage, sacrifice, honor. Even though she wasn't enlisted, she had lived those values in the most dangerous moment of her life. A letter from the Commandant of the Marine Corps was hand-delivered to the hospital the next day. It read, "Miss Emily Carter, your act of selfless bravery reflects the highest traditions of duty, even without obligation. You defended one of our own with a courage we hold sacred. You will forever be recognized as a friend to the Corps, Semper Fidelis." Emily cried reading it. Still, she stayed away from the spotlight. When news stations requested live interviews, she declined. When talk shows offered to fly her out and pay her, she said no. She wasn't doing this for attention. She didn't want to be famous. She wanted people to remember the Marine, the reason she stepped in at all. But quietly, behind the scenes, she started receiving hundreds of messages from young EMTs, med students, veterans, families, people saying her story had inspired them, moved them, even healed them. One message read, "My daughter wants to be a paramedic now because of you." Another, "I gave up on people until I saw what you did. Thank you for reminding me that good still exists." Those she read every night. One morning, her mother entered the room with a smile. "There's someone outside asking to see you." Emily sighed. "More press?" "No," her mother said, handing her a small box. Inside was a silver pendant with the Marine Corps emblem engraved on it, and behind it a note. "You're not just the shield, you're the heart. From all of us, 2nd Battalion." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She clutched the pendant, her chest tight. In that moment, she realized something powerful. This wasn't about her anymore. It never was. It was about all the people who had ever stood up when they weren't supposed to, the people who stepped in, unarmed and untrained, just because it was right. She had survived, but more than that, she had become a symbol. Days after being discharged, Emily Carter returned to her quiet neighborhood in suburban San Diego. Her small house sat at the end of a tree-lined street, where the loudest noise most mornings came from garbage trucks and barking dogs. She was still healing, moving slowly, her stitches tight, her breath shallow, but the peace was welcome. She hadn't told many people she was coming home, only close friends, family, and her work supervisor knew. The hospital had offered a security detail, but she declined. Emily wanted to go home, not feel like a patient under guard. That first night, she barely slept. Not from pain, though that was still present, but from the sheer weight of everything that had happened. Every time she closed her eyes, flashes came back. The knife, the blood, her own scream, and the Marine's face. She hadn't heard from Corporal James Rivas since they last spoke at the hospital. He was recovering too, though word from the nurses said he was doing well, strong even. Emily hoped he was okay. She had felt something shift in that hospital room with him. Though she couldn't explain it, a bond formed under fire, silent, deep. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. Emily was in the kitchen, moving carefully, trying to pour herself a cup of tea. Her mom, staying with her temporarily, answered the door. What she saw made her gasp. Across the lawn, shoulder to shoulder, stood over 100 United Street 8th Marines in full dress uniform. They formed a perfect block on the street in front of the house, their boots aligned, their posture straight, their faces stoic. At the center stood Corporal James Rivas, supported by a single crutch, upright, proud, and composed. He wore no hat, just medals. Emily, hearing her mother gasp, peeked from the hallway. Her breath caught. She stepped forward slowly, her body still weak, and opened the door fully, stepping out onto the porch with the help of a railing. Her bare feet touched the cool concrete. She didn't know what to say. The Marine said nothing. Then, on a silent cue, they raised their hands and saluted all at once. The sound of hundreds of arms snapping upward in perfect unison echoed across the quiet street. Emily froze. Her eyes welled with tears, her mouth trembled, and her heart raced in disbelief. Corporal Rivas stepped forward, slowly but deliberately. He stopped at the edge of her lawn, raised a hand again, then lowered it as he spoke. "You stood between death and one of ours," he said, loud enough for neighbors to hear. "Today, we stand for you." Emily covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Neighbors opened their windows, their doors. Some filmed, some clapped quietly, others simply watched in stunned silence. Children peeked from behind curtains. Older veterans stood at attention in their yards. Rivas continued, "We do not forget those who protect our own, whether in uniform or out." Then he stepped aside, allowing 2 Marines to walk up the driveway. One held a folded American flag, the other a polished wooden box. They stopped in front of Emily, straightened, and presented both. The Marine with the flag spoke first. "On behalf of the United States Marine Corps, we present you this flag, a symbol of courage and sacrifice." The other opened the wooden box. Inside was a custom-forged challenge coin, larger than any she had seen. One side bore the Marine Corps emblem, the other had a hand-carved engraving, "To the shield, from those you stood for." Emily accepted both with shaking hands. I don't deserve this, she whispered. Riva stepped closer. You earned more than this. You gave without question. That's what makes a warrior. Her mother stood behind her now, crying softly, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder as the Marines, still in formation, held their salute. Then a voice from the crowd shouted, 3 cheers for EMT Carter. The Marines responded, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. The moment broke Emily. She wept openly now, overwhelmed, unable to process it all. Rivas reached out, placing a single hand on her shoulder. You didn't just save me, he said. You changed us. The Marines stood silently a while longer before quietly dispersing, row by row, their boots tapping the pavement in rhythmic steps. Some tipped their hats to Emily as they passed, others nodded in respect. No media, no speeches, just presence, just honor. Rivas remained a few minutes longer. They sat together on the front steps, watching the sunrise peek over the rooftops. I didn't know what to expect, Emily said finally, her voice soft. You deserve to feel what we feel. Every time someone has our back, Rivas replied. There was a long silence. Then he asked, would it be okay if I visited again? Emily smiled. I'd like that. As the sun climbed higher and the last of the Marines disappeared into the distance, Emily looked at the flag in her lap and the coin in her hand. It didn't feel real, but it was. She hadn't just come home. She had come home to something greater respect earned not from rank or uniform, but from courage. The kind that stands when everyone else watches. The kind that bleeds for a stranger and still doesn't back down. Emily Carter would never be the same. Neither would the men who saluted her that morning. The story of Emily Carter's bravery had spread far beyond her quiet San Diego neighborhood. News stations picked it up after a neighbor's video of the Marine salute went viral. Headlines read, Civilian EMT risks life to save Marine, gets hero salute. Emily wasn't interested in the attention. She ignored most interview requests, declined talk shows, and never opened the dozens of emails asking for rights to her story. She hadn't done it for recognition. She'd done it because someone needed help. That was the job. That was who she was. Still, healing was harder than she'd expected. The stab wounds had left deep muscle damage. Her ribs were still tender. One hand, which had tried to grab the attacker's blade, was struggling to regain full movement. She underwent painful physical therapy twice a week, working on gripping, lifting, and building strength back in her arms. The doctors warned it could take a year or more. Some days, the pain was unbearable, not just physically, but mentally. The worst part wasn't the stabbing. It was the replay in her head, over and over. The moment she realized she might die, the helplessness, the blood, the fear that if she'd hesitated even a second longer, Corporal Rivas might not have survived. That haunted her, but she wasn't alone. Corporal Rivas kept his promise. He visited every week. At first, he came with updates about his recovery. His leg was improving, his internal injuries healing faster than doctors expected. But quickly, their visits turned into something more. They would sit on Emily's porch, drinking coffee and watching neighborhood kids ride their bikes. They talked about everything, from childhood dreams to the music they loved. He told her stories from his last deployment. She told him about her most bizarre EMT calls. There was something unspoken between them, a bond not just forged in trauma, but in shared resilience. Rivas helped her believe in her strength again. One day, after a particularly rough therapy session, Emily came home frustrated. She could barely open a jar. Her hand trembled, her stitches ached, and her patience was gone. Rivas was already waiting at her porch with 2 bags. What's that? She asked, annoyed. He grinned. Today, we fight your worst enemy. He pulled out Lego sets. What the hell? She laughed through her pain. Motor skills, he said. Marine-approved rehab. That evening, they sat on the floor for hours, building a miniature battleship. It took her 20 minutes to fit one piece properly, but she finished it. She cried when she did not because of the Lego, but because it reminded her healing was not linear, but it was still progress. As time passed, Emily returned to the station, not as a full-time responder, but in a light-duty capacity. She trained new EMTs, led workshops, and gave safety talks. Her team welcomed her with open arms. But more than that, something else began taking shape. Her name had become known in local military circles. Invitations started coming in not just to ceremonies, but to speak about courage, about civilians stepping up, about what it means to face danger with no armor but purpose. One particular evening, she was asked to speak at a joint Army-Marine fundraiser. She stood before hundreds of people, uniformed men and women, officials, doctors, and civilians, and told her story, not as a victim or even as a hero, but as a human who made a choice. "I didn't have time to think about what I might lose," she said. "I only thought about what I might save." The room stood in applause. After the event, Rivas walked her to the car. She looked stunning in a simple black dress. He was in formal blues. "Do you ever think," he asked, "how different everything would have been if you didn't stop that day?" "All the time," she said quietly. They stood there in silence, the hum of the night around them. Then Rivas did something he hadn't done in all those weeks. He reached for her hand, the same hand that had grabbed a knife blade to shield him, and held it. Neither said a word, but something had changed. Later that month, Emily was invited to Washington, D.C. The Marine Corps had nominated her for the Distinguished Public Service Award, the highest honor they could give a civilian. She was shocked. She hadn't even known such a thing existed. The ceremony was formal, quiet, and intimate, held at the Marine Corps headquarters. As she stood before the commandant himself, receiving the medal, her heart pounded harder than it had the night of the attack. Because in that moment, surrounded by military brass and national attention, she still felt like just a woman who did what was right. Rivas was in the front row, smiling. Back home, things weren't back to normal, because nothing would ever be the same again. But in many ways, they were better. Her hand had regained most of its movement. The scars, though ugly, had faded into pink trails of survival. She could sleep now without jolting awake. Her neighbors greeted her with more than just politeness. There was admiration, warmth, and respect. One afternoon she was walking out of a store when she saw a young boy fall from his bike across the street. Without hesitation, she ran to him, checked his injuries, calmed his crying, and helped him up, just like before. Because underneath it all, Emily was still Emily, still the one who ran in when others stood still. Emily Carter had never imagined how far her single act of courage would ripple while she returned to a quieter rhythm physical therapy, light EMT duties, and community talks the world hadn't forgotten. Her story was now inspiring others to act. A woman in Arizona pulled an unconscious driver from a burning car and said later, "I thought of that EMT girl who shielded a Marine with her body. If she could risk everything, so could I." Emily was stunned. She didn't feel like a symbol, but the more she tried to shrink away from it, the more the world kept holding her up. Letters poured in: veterans, widows, kids in ROTC, young women studying to become EMTs. One letter came from a 2-year-old girl named Harper who wrote, "You made me feel like girls can be strong too. When I grow up, I want to help people like you." Emily sat quietly after reading that one, tears slowly filling her eyes. She never wanted fame, but maybe, just maybe, this was the kind of spotlight that helped change something. Meanwhile, Corporal Rivas had a mission of his own. He was back on limited duty at the base, but every weekend, without fail, he visited Emily. They would walk together by the pier, try new food trucks, or just sit on the roof of her building and watch planes disappear into the distance. Yet, he knew there was one thing he hadn't told her yet, something that kept him awake at night. He had recently learned why he'd been attacked that night. Military intelligence finally confirmed that Rivas had unknowingly become the target of a criminal ring smuggling stolen military gear through civilian ports. During his leave, he had noticed suspicious activity near a shipment facility and reported it. Turns out, the wrong people found out. The stabbing wasn't random, it was retaliation. He wasn't supposed to survive, but he did, because of Emily. One afternoon, they sat in a quiet corner of the beach. Rivas finally spoke. "They wanted me dead. That wasn't a mugging, it was a hit." She didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "And if I hadn't stepped in, I wouldn't be here." She stared at the ocean, then looked back at him. "So, what now? Are you safe?" He nodded. "They arrested the main guys. But yeah, I've been assigned protection until the case is closed. Emily leaned back on the sand. So, I saved a whistleblower. Great. Now I'm in a real action movie. He laughed. She did too. Despite everything, they found peace in the moments between. Rivas started calling her M. She started calling him Trouble. It wasn't flirtation, it was survival. It was knowing that after facing death together, they now had permission to laugh. A surprise came. The White House reached out. The president himself had heard her story and wanted to meet her. Emily's jaw dropped when she read the email. At first, she thought it was spam, but days later, a black government SUV pulled up to her door with official escorts. At the White House, she was honored in a private ceremony, not just for bravery, but for representing the extraordinary spirit of American civilians who don't wear the uniform but serve just the same. She stood beside generals, cabinet members, and even a Medal of Honor recipient. But in the back of the room, she only looked for one face, Rivas's. He nodded. She held her medal, stunned. She was just a girl who stepped in. That evening, they returned to her apartment. She placed the award on a shelf beside a photo of her parents and a tiny Lego battleship. Rivas turned serious. I don't want to waste time anymore. She tilted her head. What do you mean? I don't want to just visit on weekends. I don't want to just thank you. I want to be there with you. For you. Her heart pounded. He wasn't just saying thank you. He was saying, I love you, without needing to say it. Emily looked at him and said softly, I was hoping you'd say that. The next morning, Emily woke to the smell of coffee. Rivas had beat her to the kitchen, wearing one of her old hoodies, humming a terrible rendition of a country song. She stood in the doorway and smiled. She had bled on this floor, screamed here, cried here, but now she felt safe not because she was healed, but because she had hope. He turned and offered her a mug. Morning, hero. She rolled her eyes. Still not a hero. He kissed her forehead. Still disagree. That day, she had another interview, a national magazine this time, but she was getting better at telling her story. When asked, what was going through your mind that night? She paused and said, nothing. There was no time to think. There was just someone in danger, and I had 2 feet, 2 hands, and a heartbeat. That's all I needed. And just like that, she gave the world another quote they'd never forget. Months after the attack, the world had settled into a new rhythm for Emily Carter. The chaos had quieted. The media moved on to other stories. But Emily's life had changed in every way, publicly, privately, permanently. She had returned to part-time work, slowly easing into emergency calls again. At first, her body resisted. The scars ached. Flashbacks would trigger during high-stress moments, like when a call came in about a stabbing or a soldier hurt in the street. But she learned to breathe through the fear, not erase it, but work with it. It made her stronger. And back at home, Rivas never left her side. Their bond deepened beyond friendship, beyond gratitude. They were more than survivors. They had become each other's reason to keep moving forward. One quiet morning, Emily received a letter, not an email, but a formal wax-sealed envelope from the Secretary of Defense. She was being invited to speak at a memorial service for Armed Forces Day, held at Arlington National Cemetery. She wasn't a soldier. She didn't wear a uniform, but her actions had reminded many of what it meant to live with courage. The letter described her as a civilian with the heart of a warrior. Emily sat with the envelope for an hour before speaking a word. Rivas walked in, saw the seal, and smiled. You going? She nodded slowly. If I can speak for all of us who never enlisted but still showed up, I will. When they arrived in Washington, the event was grander than Emily expected. Thousands of chairs lined the green cemetery grounds. Flags rippled in the wind. Bagpipes hummed low in the distance. She wore a navy blue dress with the pin she'd received from the Marines on her collar. In the crowd sat generals, politicians, Gold Star families, and active-duty service members from every branch. Among them were survivors like her civilians who had stepped up in emergencies. As she approached the podium, her legs trembled slightly, but then she saw a familiar sight in the third row. 100 Marines in dress uniform, the same ones who had stood on her lawn that morning, who had held their salute without a word, who had carried her story when she could barely walk. They were here again, not as a publicity stunt, but as family. She began to speak. I'm not a soldier. I've never been to boot camp. I don't know what it feels like to take orders in battle. But I do know this. Courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes courage is bleeding on the sidewalk, refusing to step aside. Sometimes courage is dragging someone behind a dumpster because you know they'll die if you don't move. Sometimes courage is choosing to care, even when it's easier to walk away. I didn't act that night because I was brave. I acted because I could. She paused, her voice steady despite the tears forming. I share this moment with every nurse who stayed past her shift, every teacher who shielded students, every bystander who said, "Not on my watch." You don't need stripes on your sleeve to stand for something. You just need heart. The crowd rose to their feet. Some cried, many saluted, and somewhere in the front row a young cadet whispered to his friend, "She's the reason I joined." After the ceremony, Emily and Rivas walked slowly through the cemetery, hand in hand. The rows of white headstones stood silently around them, a sacred sea of sacrifice. At one grave, Rivas stopped. It belonged to a Marine who'd saved his life during a deployment overseas. Emily stood quietly, letting him have the moment. Rivas knelt, placed a coin on the headstone and whispered, "We're not done paying it forward." As he stood, he looked at her and said, "You know, they want me to help train the next generation leadership school, teaching resilience. I said I'd only do it on one condition." She raised an eyebrow. "Which is, you come with me." Emily laughed. "I'm not joining the Corps, Rivas." He smirked. "Not as a soldier, as a speaker, a partner, a mentor. Someone who shows them that bravery isn't just about combat, it's about compassion." She smiled. Then, "Yeah, I'm in." Months passed. Emily's story became a curriculum case study in training courses for first responders and military medics. She toured base camps and schools, giving talks. She held hands with widows and hugged young kids in military families. She laughed on late-night shows and cried in local churches. But through it all, she never lost her core. She was still the EMT who didn't run, the woman who stood between a blade and a stranger, the civilian with 7 scars and 1,000 reasons to keep going. On the anniversary of the attack, she returned to that same taco shop. Rivas waited across the street, giving her space. She placed a single red flower on the curb and whispered, "Thank you for letting me be needed that night." As she stood, a small girl tugged at her jeans. "Are you the hero, lady?" Emily knelt. "I'm just someone who helped." The girl smiled. "I want to help people too." Emily hugged her. "That means you already are." As she walked back across the street, Rivas reached for her hand. The sun was setting, but her story wasn't over, not even close. In the heart-wrenching tale of Emily Carter, an ordinary EMT who became an extraordinary hero, we uncover a profound life lesson that resonates deeply with all of us. True courage isn't born from capes or uniforms, but from the quiet instinct to stand up for what's right, even when fear screams to run away. Emily's story isn't just about being stabbed 7 times while shielding a wounded Marine from ruthless attackers. It's a raw reminder that in our everyday lives, we all face moments where we can choose to intervene or look the other way. She didn't hesitate, throwing her body into harm's way not for glory, but because she saw a fellow human in peril. That single act rippled outward, saving a life, inspiring a nation, and earning her the unwavering respect of the Marine Corps, who saluted her at dawn like one of their own. It tugs at our emotions, doesn't it? The pain she endured, the blood she shed, the tears she cried in recovery, all for a stranger who became family. This teaches us that heroism lives in the mundane, a helping hand to a neighbor, speaking up against injustice, or simply being present when someone needs you most. In a world often divided and indifferent, Emily's bravery shows that one person's selflessness can ignite hope, heal divisions, and remind us of our shared humanity. It challenges us to ask, what would I do in that moment? Would I step forward or step back? Her scars became symbols of strength, her pain a pathway to profound connections, proving that vulnerability and valor go hand in hand. Let this story stir your soul, embrace the courage within you, for it might just change everything. If Emily's incredible journey moved you as much as it did me, drop a comment below. What's one act of courage you've witnessed or performed that changed a life? Share your thoughts, and let's inspire each other. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these heart-stirring stories that remind us of the best in humanity. Your support means the world. Let's build a community of everyday heroes together.